Tonight, I'm going to tell you stories from the Pokemon world. Facts about things that are there, but only if you happen to look on the right day, with the right Pokemon in your party, at the right moment. If you miss that tiny window, the place might as well not exist at all. There are moves that quietly do the opposite of what they promise, changing your chances without ever telling you. Episodes of the anime that were shown once, then locked away so completely that most fans only ever heard rumors. Strange shapes hidden in the data of old games that were never meant to be seen, yet still appear if you walk in exactly the wrong direction. Somewhere in an early region, there is a single object on the map that does nothing at all. It just sits there, silent and unused, while an entire generation of players whispers that something incredible must be hiding near it. In another region, there is a tower that stays completely empty until you fulfill a condition the game never clearly explains. You do not need to know what any of these things are yet. For now, you can just lie back and let the questions float past. What kind of island only appears for some people and not for others? What kind of glitch becomes more famous than many real Pokemon? How can a cartoon episode be so powerful that it disappears forever after a single night? As you get comfortable, you do not have to solve any of it. You can simply listen while we move slowly through forgotten corners, broken code, hidden mechanics, and quiet secrets that sit between the pixels of the games and the frames of the show. If your eyes stay open, you might find out what these stories are really about. If they close before we get there, that is fine too. The mysteries will still be here, waiting inside the Pokemon world every time you come back. So take a breath, let the day fall away, and we will begin. Did you know that in Pokémon, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald on the Game Boy Advance, there is a secret place called Mirage Island, sitting out on Route 130? Most of the time, if you surf across that route, you will never see it. The water looks completely normal. The wild encounters are completely normal. But every in-game day, the game quietly picks a random number. Every Pokemon in your party has its own hidden number as well, called a personality value. If the lower half of that hidden value in any one of your Pokemon just happens to be exactly the same as the number the game chose for that day, Mirage Island appears. If nothing matches, it simply does not exist for you at all. You can picture that for a moment. You are standing in Pacific Log Town, a little village floating on logs in the sea. There is an old man in the lower right house who spends his days staring out at the waves. Most of the time, if you talk to him, he says he cannot see any island today. But on the rare day when the random number and one of your Pokemon line up, he suddenly tells you that there is a mysterious island on the horizon. Only then does the route change, and a small strip of land appears out of nowhere on the map. Years can go by in a playthrough of Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald without that match ever happening. For many players, Mirage Island was nothing more than a line in a strategy guide, or a story from someone else who swore they had seen it once. For a very small number of people, it was a real place they washed up on one afternoon, and then never managed to find again. Not every secret in Pokémon is that quiet. Some of them shout by accident. In Pokémon Red and Blue on the original Game Boy, there is a glitch that appears when you push the game into loading data from the wrong place in memory. If you talk to the old man in Viridian City, who shows you how to catch a Pokemon, then immediately fly to Cinnabar Island and surf up and down along the right-hand edge of the island. The game can throw something at you that is not part of the normal Pokédex at all. Instead of a regular wild encounter, the screen fills with a jagged, broken sprite. The name bar shows strange letters. The cry sounds harsh and wrong for the tiny speaker. Players started calling it Missing No, short for missing number. If you run from that battle or catch it, the game quietly adds 128 copies to whatever item is in the 6th slot of your bag, up to a glitched total over 99. A handful of programming decisions meant to test the Pokédex turned into one of the most famous item duplication tricks in gaming history. You can imagine that coastline on Cinnabar Island in your head, the small sprite on a Lapras moving up and down in a thin vertical line. Most of the time, you meet Tentacool and other ordinary sea Pokémon. Every so often, the wild battle screen slides in with a corrupted shape instead. And for a second, it feels less like you are battling a creature, and more like you are looking at the game's skeleton through a crack. Even moves that look straightforward can hide something like this. In those same first-generation games, Pokémon Red, Blue, and Yellow, there is a move called Focus Energy. The idea in the text is clear. Your Pokémon focuses and becomes more likely to land critical hits. But because of a bug in how Generation I calculates critical hit rate, Focus Energy does the opposite. Instead of multiplying your chance, the game divides it, cutting your odds of a critical hit down to a quarter of what they should be. Think back to using it as a kid. You press the button. The text says, "Your Pokémon is getting pumped," and you feel like you are preparing for a big, decisive blow. Nothing on the surface tells you that a hidden flag is being flipped the wrong way. All you see is that the amazing critical hits you wanted never seem to come when you need them most. Far away from your living room, a single bit in the code is being shifted in the wrong direction, and the game never tells you. Some secrets are not bugs at all, but myths that slipped into the cartridge on purpose. Magikarp is one of the weakest Pokémon in the entire series. In Pokémon Red, Blue, and Yellow, it is almost useless in battle. It knows almost nothing, does almost nothing, and faints from almost anything. It looks like a joke encounter, something you either run from or carry around only to evolve as quickly as possible. But the way Magikarp evolves is based on an old Chinese legend. In that story, ordinary carp swim upstream and try to leap over a powerful waterfall called the Dragon Gate. Most fail and are washed back down. The rare ones that make it over the top are transformed into dragons. Magikarp, turning into the huge sea serpent Gyarados at level 20, is a direct nod to that tale. A digital fish becomes a dragon because somewhere during development, someone remembered a very old story about persistence. You can picture that moment of evolution on the Game Boy screen. For hours of play, your little orange fish can barely do anything except splash and tackle. Then one day, the music shifts into the evolution tune. The screen flashes white. The tiny fish stretches and twists into a long, roaring monster that suddenly looks like it could tear through whole teams on its own. A bedtime story about effort and reward retold in 8-bit sprites. Even the move splash itself has a small twist beneath the surface. In English, the name suggests water going everywhere, but the Japanese name of the move is hanaru, a verb that usually means to hop or to jump. It was never meant to be a water move at all. That is why land-based Pokémon like Hoppip and Spoink can learn Splash, even though they have no connection to oceans or lakes. They are not splashing, they are bouncing. A mistranslation in Generation Y turned a simple jumping move into a permanent water joke that the series has carried ever since. If you picture a quiet battle against a Spoink for a second, it almost feels like the move was made for falling asleep. The tiny pig bounces gently on its springtail, using Splash again and again. The health bars never move. The background never changes. The text box keeps repeating that nothing happened, as if the game itself is slowly drifting off. The TV side of Pokémon has its own strange corners. In Japan in 1997, the episode Den-o Senshi Porygon of the original Pokémon anime aired once and then vanished from rotation. In one scene, Pikachu uses an electric attack on incoming missiles inside a virtual world. The resulting explosion flashes red and blue lights rapidly across the screen. That short sequence triggered photosensitive seizures and other symptoms in hundreds of children watching at home. Around 685 viewers were taken to hospital, and the broadcast caused such a shock that the anime went on hiatus. The episode has never been shown again on television in any country. If you imagine a small living room in Japan at that time, a child sitting close to a heavy glass television, it becomes a very different kind of Pokémon memory. Bright flashes where there should have been safe colors. A warm, familiar show suddenly turning into something that sends people to the hospital. Because the episode never aired again, most fans outside Japan only know it as a rumor, a news headline, or a paragraph in an article about banned television. Another early episode, The Legend of Dratini, disappeared from international schedules for a different reason. In that story, Ash and his friends visit the Safari Zone in the Kanto region. The warden of the zone, an older man called Kaiser, repeatedly points realistic guns directly at the main characters and even fires at Team Rocket. The episode aired normally in Japan in 1997, but when it came time to localize the show, American and other Western broadcasters decided that the amount of gun use was too intense for a children's cartoon. The episode was never dubbed into English and never officially aired in most countries. Because of that, many viewers outside Japan grew up watching Ash suddenly own a whole herd of toros without ever seeing how he caught them. The gap where that adventure should sit became its own quiet mystery, sitting between episodes in a way you might only notice if you try to re-watch the series in order. While the anime was wrestling with banned episodes, the games were busy creating urban legends out of completely ordinary pixels. In Pokémon Red and Blue's Kanto region, at the harbor in Vermilion City, where the SS Anne docks, there's a single truck sprite placed on a piece of land you cannot normally reach. It has no purpose in the game. You cannot enter it. You cannot move it. You cannot get an item from it. It is just scenery. But sometime in the late 1990s, a rumor started circulating among players. If you used strength on that truck, or if you did a series of complicated steps to reach it without letting the SS Anne leave, you could find Mew hiding underneath it. Of course, the code does not hide Mew there at all. Modern glitch research confirms that unless you start rewriting the game yourself with arbitrary code execution, the truck will never do anything. Yet for years, kids traded tips about it in schoolyards, exactly as if it were a real secret. You can imagine walking your tiny sprite up to the truck, pressing the A button from each side, feeling sure that there must be something more. When nothing happens, the story does not quite die. It just moves on to the next friend group, the next message board, the next generation of players hearing about the truck with Mew under it. Not every hidden thing is a mistake or a myth. Some are deliberately buried behind patient, slow play. In Pokémon Diamond and Pearl on the Nintendo DS, there is a place called the Hallowed Tower on Route 209 in the Sinnoh region. At first, when you inspect it, nothing happens. If you place an item called the Odd Keystone into the tower and then go down into the Sinnoh Underground, the game starts counting how many other players or wandering NPCs you talk to there. Only after you have spoken with 32 of them does something change. When you return to the Hallowed Tower and interact with it again, a battle starts with Spiritomb, a ghostly Pokémon bound to the keystone with no weaknesses in that generation. Most casual players never meet Spiritomb this way on their first run. The requirement is not written clearly in the game. It quietly rewards the kind of slow social exploring that happens late at night when you are just wandering and talking rather than racing to finish the story. Somewhere in the save file, an unseen counter climbs one interaction at a time until it finally tips over and a face appears in the stone. Even the names of some very familiar fighters carry secrets that you can only see if someone points them out. In English versions of the games, the kicking specialist Hitmonlee and the punching specialist Hitmonchan are named as little nods to Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. Their Japanese names, Sawamular and Ebiwalar, are references to different real fighters: kickboxer Tadashi Sawamura and world champion boxer Hiroyuki Ibihara. When the games were localized, the original references were swapped out for ones that Western audiences were more likely to recognize, so that kids seeing the names Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan on their Game Boy screens might make the same connection to martial arts stars that Japanese kids made to their own local heroes. Somewhere in an office during the 1990s, someone went through a list of possible names and quietly changed who those Pokémon were pointing at in the real world, all to create that tiny extra moment of recognition for the player. All of these things live just under the surface of games and episodes that look very simple at first glance. A hidden island that only appears when numbers line up. A glitched creature that duplicates your items. A move that does the opposite of what it says. A fish that becomes a dragon because of an old legend. A truck that does nothing but carries a rumor for decades. A stone tower that only wakes up after exactly 32 quiet conversations. You do not have to hunt any of them down tonight. You do not have to see Mirage Island yourself, or test Missing No, or count NPCs in the Sinnoh Underground. You can just lie back, listen, and let these small, odd corners of the Pokémon world drift past you like distant routes on a map you are not in a hurry to explore. If you look away from the cartridges for a moment and think about the anime instead, the tone of Pokémon starts to shift in small, unexpected ways. Early in the Indigo League, there is a beach episode that turned into its own quiet piece of history. On the surface, it is simple: a seaside town, a beauty contest, and the usual trouble from Team E Rocket. But in one set of scenes, James walks in wearing a blue bikini and a pair of inflated, obviously fake breasts. He strikes poses, jokes with Misty, and treats the whole thing like a competition he fully expects to win. In Japan, the episode aired. Outside Japan, those same scenes were considered too much for a children's show at the time. For years, the whole episode was skipped in early English language runs. When it finally did make it over, it showed up as a kind of lost episode, heavily edited, with those inflatable scenes quietly removed. The story still takes place at the beach. The plot still moves forward. But the strangest part, the bit that made censors uncomfortable, is simply gone. Kids who watched it later had no idea that an earlier version even existed. You can imagine the contrast. A Japanese viewer in 1997 laughs at James wobbling around in a ridiculous outfit. A viewer in another country never sees that visual at all, only a softened version. The location, the characters, the plot are the same. The shape of the episode is different in each place, adjusted by what local broadcasters thought was acceptable. Another character from that era had to be changed everywhere, not just in one episode. Jinx, the ice and psychic Pokémon with the long hair and dress, originally appeared with a very dark skin tone, big lips, and features that reminded some critics of old racist caricatures. For a while, the games and anime kept using that design. Then complaints and articles began to appear, pointing out how uncomfortable that silhouette looked to many viewers. The response was quiet but permanent. In later games and later airings of the show, Jinx's skin color was changed to a bright purple instead. If you grew up playing from the second generation onwards, you might only ever remember Jinx as purple. For someone who saw the original sprites or the first broadcast of certain episodes, the change is striking. The outline is the same. The dress is the same. But the color of the face is not. One tiny shift in the palette turns a controversy into something that most younger fans never notice at all. That same Jinx design caused problems for a holiday special too. An early Christmas-themed episode centered around the character was quietly pulled from rotation in some places and rarely shown again in others, because it leaned so heavily on the older, dark-skinned version of Jinx. For a long time, it became one of those episodes that existed more in lists and articles than in normal reruns. A seasonal story overshadowed by a design that had already been replaced. While the anime wrestled with these changes on television, the trading card game was quietly building its own set of legends in binders and shoeboxes. One of the most famous promo cards from the movie era is Ancient Mew. If you ever held one, you might remember how different it felt compared to a regular card. The artwork shows a stylized Mew floating over strange symbols, and the card's name, attacks, and text are printed in runic-looking characters instead of normal writing. It feels more like a relic than a game piece, like something dug up from a ruin in the Pokémon world. Because of that special text, Ancient Mew was effectively unplayable in serious tournaments. Judges could not reasonably expect every player to know what those runes meant, or to be able to read the card in the middle of a match. It became a card you collected for the artwork and the story, not for its strength in a deck. Kids would trade for it in school, not because it won games, but because it looked like a secret language on shiny foil. While Ancient Mew was intentionally strange, another card spent years half existing and half not, like a rumor with cardboard edges. At pre-release events in the late 90s, Wizards of the Coast printed special clefable cards with the word pre-release stamped on them in gold. At some point during that era, a small batch of base set Raichu cards were also stamped by accident. Staff who worked there talked about it quietly. Collectors whispered about a pre-release Raichu that should not exist. Officially, the company denied it. For nearly 2 decades, all anyone had were stories and a few unverified photos. Slowly, that rumor solidified. A former employee showed an actual copy. Grading companies examined the font and the foil and concluded that some of these cards were real, not clever fakes. Auction houses began listing them, and prices climbed into jaw-dropping territory. What started as a printing mistake during a test run turned into one of the rarest and most argued about cards in the entire Pokémon TCG, a kind of real-world equivalent to a glitch Pokémon. Something the code of the product never meant to release, but did. You can picture the journey. In 1999, somewhere in a factory, a sheet of Raichu cards gets the wrong gold stamp. A staff member slips one into a pocket as a curiosity. It sits in a drawer for years, forgotten. Then, decades later, it lies under glass at an auction. While people bid more money on it than most kids ever imagined a single card could be worth. All for one extra word printed in a tiny space. Not all the darker edges of Pokémon live in banned episodes or misprinted cards. Some are drawn right into the panels of the manga. The long-running manga, often called Pokémon Adventures in English, follows characters who feel closer to the game protagonists than to Ash. Its tone is still adventurous and hopeful, but it does not shy away from showing danger more directly than the TV series. In one often cited scene, a Charmeleon slashes through an Arbok with its claw. The panel makes it look as though the snake has been cut cleanly in half. In others, characters in Pokémon get turned to stone, possessed, or attacked in ways that feel much more intense than anything you would normally see on Saturday morning television. For many readers who discovered the manga later, this contrast was surprising. The covers show familiar faces and creatures, but the interior treats battles and villains with sharper edges. It is still recognizably Pokémon, but the stakes feel higher, the shadows a little deeper. It is another layer of the same world, retold in a medium that is allowed to go just a bit further. Back in the anime, Team Rocket themselves are a kind of constant thread that ties all these different tones together. In most episodes, Jessie, James, and Meowth are comic relief. They show up, recite a motto, unveil some ridiculous machine or disguise, and are blasted off again. But even their famous motto did not stay the same everywhere. In Japanese, the words often lean into puns, wordplay, and slightly more poetic lines about love, evil, and their own sense of twisted pride. In English and other languages, the motto was rewritten to fit the rhythm and humor that local audiences would understand, with lines like "prepare for trouble" and "make it double" becoming catchphrases on their own. If you listen to different dubs, you can hear how the same basic idea is dressed up in different cultural clothing. The gestures are the same, the poses are the same, but the words slot into different rhymes and references in each language. For a sleepy viewer, half awake on the couch, that consistency is comforting. No matter how strange the episode gets, Team Rocket will probably show up, announce themselves, and fail in roughly the same way every time. The trading card game has its own forms of censorship and redesign beyond Jinx. Some card artworks that originally showed guns religious symbols, or more suggestive imagery were altered or never released in certain regions. A card might show up in a Japanese set with a background detail that later gets removed for the international version. A trainer might hold a realistic-looking firearm in one print and have it replaced or cropped out in another. The mechanics on the card stay the same, but the picture shifts just enough to meet different standards around the world. If you imagine flipping through a binder full of cards from different languages and years, you might spot these differences only if someone points them out. A hand is in a slightly different position. A statue is gone. A symbol on a building has been redrawn. They are small visual edits that most players never notice in the heat of a casual game, but they show how often Pokemon's artwork has been adjusted to fit the places it travels. While manga panels and card frames get tweaked, the games keep hiding their own quiet oddities in code and corner cases. Somewhere in all of these layers, the line between mistake and design gets blurry. An episode is pulled not because of a glitch, but because of how a costume reads on screen. A card is effectively banned not because it is too strong, but because the text is printed in a script nobody can reasonably be expected to read. A manga panel lets a slash land a little too visibly. A video game sprite's skin changes from black to purple between generations without most younger players knowing why. Taken one by one, each of these details is just a small footnote in a much larger franchise. Taken together, they form a map of all the places where Pokémon brushed up against the edges of what was acceptable for kids' media at the time and had to bend, redraw, recolor, or quietly hide something away. And still, for somebody somewhere, each one is a core memory. The kid who opened an ancient Mew at the cinema and stared more at the symbols than the picture. The kid who heard about a secret Raichu that might not be real. The reader who first realized the manga could go to darker places. The viewer who never understood why certain episodes were missing from their local reruns. They are all just different corners of the same world, flickering in and out of view depending on which version you happen to see, which language you heard, and which card or comic happened to land in your hands. In the second generation of games, Gold and Silver on the Game Boy Color, there is a strange kind of ghost hidden inside the cartridge. If you travel to Kanto in those games, you can visit Fuchsia City, but the famous Safari Zone from Red and Blue is gone. The gate building is locked. An NPC tells you that the warden is on vacation. As a normal player, that is the end of it. You accept that the old park simply does not exist anymore and move on. But in the data, the Safari Zone is still there. Hidden away in the code is an unfinished version of the old Kanto Safari Zone map, incomplete and inaccessible without cheats. The buildings are not quite right. The borders look strange. Some water is surrounded by nothing at all. The warp tiles are broken. There are no special safari encounters in the grass. It feels like walking through the memory of a place instead of the real thing. You can imagine loading into that unused map for the first time with a cheat device. The music plays, but there are no tourists. The usual signboards do not work. You walk over tiles that were never meant to hold your sprite, through an area that the developer started and then quietly abandoned because there was no space or time left to finish it. Later, in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they would add a new safari zone somewhere else and turn the old location into Pal Park instead. But this half-finished version of the original park remains tucked away in the second generation like an echo. That is not the only place where Kanto leaves a shadow behind. Early development versions of Gold and Silver also had other leftover pieces of Kanto, like early maps that still included the old zoo in front of Fuchsia and different versions of familiar routes. Some of these maps never make it into the final game at all, except as unused data. The idea of returning to Kanto after Johto was ambitious, and not every piece of that plan survived. The result is a sequel that lets you walk through a smaller, altered version of the region you remember, while the rest of it sits hidden behind the scenes as scraps of what might have been. If you zoom in from the whole region down to a single town, you find one of the most quietly unsettling places in the early games. Lavender Town in Red and Blue is just a handful of houses, a Pokemart, a center, and a tall tower. On the surface, it is very simple. But the music is higher and more melancholy than the tracks in the neighboring routes. The Pokemon Tower acts as a graveyard, filled with tombstones and mourners. For the first time in the series, the games talk plainly about Pokemon dying, about spirits that refuse to rest, about a Marowak whose ghost has to be calmed before the story can move on. Years later, a creepypasta started circling the internet called the Lavender Town Syndrome. It claimed that an early version of the town's music contained hidden high-pitched tones that only children could hear, supposedly causing headaches, illness, or worse. The story spread because it hooked onto a real feeling that this little purple town, with its eerie theme and funeral tower, already felt like something you were not supposed to linger in for too long. In reality, there is no evidence that the original music harmed anyone. The tale is a piece of horror fiction that grew out of that uneasy atmosphere and the way people remembered feeling when they first arrived there as kids. The town, the tower, the ghost Marowak, and the strange soundtrack were all genuinely unusual in a game that mostly showed bright forests and cheerful cities. The creepypasta just took those elements and exaggerated them into a modern ghost story about a ghost story. If you move from cartridges and myths to a different part of the franchise, the tone shifts again. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games take the idea of a world filled only with Pokemon and lean into emotion more directly than the main series. In Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness on the Nintendo DS, you play as a human turned into a Pokemon with no memory of your past. You join a guild, explore dungeons, and slowly uncover a plot about time itself beginning to stop. As the story unfolds, you learn that time gears are being removed from their shrines and that the legendary Dialga, who controls time, is in danger of going mad. Eventually, you are pulled into the future, where time has already collapsed. Together with your partner and a thief named Grovel, who turns out to be trying to save the world, you fight your way back to the present and climb to the top of Temporal Tower to set things right. The twist, for a game aimed at children, is surprisingly heavy. To fix time, you have to change the future so dramatically that your own existence is erased. Grovyle sacrifices himself to drag an enemy back to the ruined timeline. After you defeat the enraged Dialga and restore the tower, your character quietly fades away, leaving your partner alone on a beach where the adventure first began. For a while, it stays that way. The credits roll with the partner grieving. Only afterward, moved by that grief, Dialga reverses things and brings you back. letting you reunite. The game gives you both the pain of losing someone and the relief of seeing them again, in a way that many players did not expect from a spin-off about talking Pokémon in tiny sprites. It is one of the reasons that people who played Mystery Dungeon as kids remember it as far more emotional than they thought it would be. While the spin-off games were exploring themes like sacrifice and erasing futures, the trading card game was busy smoothing out its own rough edges in the artwork. If you look at the earliest Japanese prints of some trainer cards and compare them to their English versions, you can see small but telling differences. On Sabrina's gaze, the psychic gym leader originally holds a master ball in a way that bends her fingers so that one looks a bit like an extended middle finger. The English release changed the pose and the composition so that her hand no longer reads that way at all. On another card, Koga's ninja trick, a small symbol appears next to a transformed Ditto in the Japanese version. It is a Buddhist character that, to many Western viewers, looks very similar to a rotated swastika. When the card was brought overseas, the symbol was redrawn into something else entirely to avoid confusion and offense. Misty's Tears is perhaps the most famous example. In the original Japanese version, Misty appears nude from the shoulders up, crying, with only her long hair and the angle of the artwork preserving modesty. For international release, that illustration was replaced completely. In the English version, Misty stays fully clothed, while a Squirtle gently wipes her tears. The name and effect of the card stay similar, but the energy of the image changes from raw vulnerability to something more playful and safe for a younger audience. If you flip through a binder that mixes Japanese and English cards from that era, you can see how the same game was visually tuned in different directions for different cultures. A dark-skinned Jinx becomes purple. An upskirt angle on a Grimaire card is reframed. A gesture, a symbol, or a pose shifts just enough to slide under a different country's radar. Back on television, similar adjustments were happening in the anime, sometimes in ways that created odd inconsistencies. The episode where the Squirtle Squad first appears famously includes scenes where police and townspeople point realistic guns around. Yet that episode kept airing in many regions. Later, in The Legend of Dratini, guns were used even more often and more directly on screen, usually for comedic timing. That episode, as you heard earlier, never aired in most countries. The end result is that some viewers grew up seeing one kind of firearm used in the show, but never the other. Not because the world inside Pokémon changed, but because someone far away in a broadcast office drew a line between which scenes were acceptable and which were not. As the franchise moved into the real world through mobile phones, new kinds of decisions had to be made about safety. When Pokémon Go first exploded in popularity, people poured out into parks, streets, and public spaces to catch virtual creatures. Early versions of the game used a system of footsteps to indicate how far away nearby Pokémon were, encouraging players to move around and triangulate their targets. As stories started to circulate about accidents, unsafe trespassing, and people wandering into places they should not, the developers quietly altered how the tracking worked. Features were simplified or removed. Interaction distances with gyms and stops were increased, and later updates focused more on remote play and gentle nudges than on having players stare at their screens while crossing roads. You can imagine someone padding down a dark street late at night, phone in hand, hypnotized by the idea of a rare spawn just a few footsteps away. You can also imagine the meetings at the developer's office, where people looked at news stories, legal concerns, and data, and decided to soften some mechanics so that the game would ask just a little less of your attention while you move through the real world. Taken together, all these details feel like different faces of the same idea. A safari zone that technically still exists, but only as an unfinished map hidden in memory. A haunted town whose real creepiness inspired entirely fictional horror stories. A spin-off where time stops and a friend has to sacrifice himself to save a future that deletes you. Card artworks that quietly change hands, symbols, or whole compositions as they travel between countries. Episodes that exist in one language but not another, edited not because of what happens in the story, but because of how it is shown. A phone game that rebalances itself because the world outside the screen is not always as safe as the gentle fields and forests inside it. All of it lives under the bright, simple surface of Pokémon that most people see at a glance. For someone lying in bed, listening with their eyes half closed, it is just another layer of trivia and quiet stories. For the people who made these games, shows, and cards, each small choice was a way of keeping that world running, adjusting it slightly so that millions of different players could keep wandering through it without ever seeing how many times it had been redrawn. If you think about Ash's journey in the anime, it almost feels like it was destined to go on forever. But originally, it was not meant to. When the Indigo League arc was being written, there were drafts where Ash actually won the whole tournament. The idea was simple. He would defeat his final opponents, become champion, and then the story would wrap up with a neat sense of completion. Somewhere along the way, the production team realized that if they crowned him too early, there would be nowhere left for his journey to go. So instead of a clean victory, they gave him a loss against a trainer named Richie. The league ended not with a trophy, but with a lesson and a promise to keep traveling. You can imagine being a kid watching that match on TV, expecting the hero to win because that is what heroes usually do. Instead, the show quietly plants something else. The idea that even in a world of magical creatures and big battles, sometimes your story keeps going precisely because you did not get the thing you wanted yet. Later, there were more moments where the writers considered changing the formula completely. After the Johto adventures, there were discussions about having Ash step aside and letting a new protagonist take over for the Hoenn region, almost like each generation of games would bring a new main character to the show. In the end, they kept him. The result is that Ash moves from region to region, getting soft reboots every few years, new companions, new clothes, but the same familiar face at the center of it all. For kids who jump in at different points, he is a constant, an anchor in a world that keeps adding new regions and new mechanics around him. Even his companions were not as fixed as they might seem. Brock, the rock-type gym leader who joins early in Kanto, was almost written out of the show permanently after the Orange Islands. For a while, Tracy Sketchit travels with Ash instead. Behind the scenes, there were worries about how Brock's original design would be perceived overseas, and questions about whether a different character might work better for international audiences. Viewer response and internal discussions eventually brought Brock back for Johto and beyond, turning Tracy into a short-lived bridge between eras rather than a permanent replacement. You can picture Brock as that steady older brother figure, cooking over campfires, giving advice, and falling in love with almost every girl they meet, sliding in and out of the cast based on decisions the audience never sees. For the kids watching, it just feels like he went away and then came back. For the people making the show, he was a piece they were not sure they could keep until they decided they did not want to let him go. While the anime was juggling long-term characters, the video games were quietly building their own legends around glitches and half-hidden mechanics. Most players eventually heard about Misingno, but fewer learned about the version of the trick that lets you meet Mew in Red and Blue without cheating devices. It involves a precise sequence, letting a certain trainer notice you, and then escaping the battle before it starts, forcing the game to store encounter data in memory. If you then fly away, battle something else, and return to Route 8 or the area near Nugget Bridge, the game tries to resolve that leftover data into a wild encounter. In just the right circumstances, the creature that appears is a level 7 Mew. You can imagine being told this by a friend on a playground, or reading it on an old website thinking it has to be fake, just another hoax like the truck in Vermilion. Then you try it step by step, heart pounding a little, and the encounter screen truly slides in with that tiny pink sprite and the name Mew. No special event, no official distribution, just a side effect of how the game handles trainers, warps, and random battles. Not all mysterious Pokémon come from glitches and exploits. Some are built deliberately to feel like they slipped out of something older. Unknown, the floating letter-shaped creatures introduced in gold and silver live in ruined chambers where the walls are covered in their symbols. In the games, you can catch them in different letter forms, and the overworld puzzles gently teach you to read their alphabet. They do not evolve. They are not particularly strong in battle. They exist mostly as living punctuation marks that hint at a larger, older language. Later on, in the Sinnoh region, the godlike Pokémon Arceus is described as having shaped the universe and left plates and ruins behind. Fans notice that the idea of ancient writing tied to a mysterious creator lines up oddly well with the unknown ruins from Johto. Officially, the games never spell out a direct connection. The designs and themes just sit next to each other, close enough to make you wonder. You can imagine a character in that world, walking through the ruins of Alph, tracing the shapes on the walls, and feeling that someone, or something, wanted to communicate in an alphabet made of living eyes. Whether that someone is Arceus, or something even older, is left to the player's imagination. On the trading card side of the franchise, a different sort of controversy swirled around a psychic-type Pokémon. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Kadabra disappeared from the Pokémon TCG. The base Abra, the final evolution Alakazam, and other parts of the line still showed up in decks, but Kadabra almost completely stopped being printed. The reason traces back to a real-life magician who felt that the character's bent spoons, star on the forehead, and name in certain languages were too close to his own stage persona. For years, the card remained absent. Players could still evolve Abra into Alakazam through special rules on the cards, skipping Kadabra entirely, but the middle stage lived mostly in memories and older sets. Only recently, after a long period of silence, did that magician publicly say that he had changed his mind and no longer objected to the character's use in the trading card game. You can imagine a kid leafing through an old binder and noticing that their favorite psychic line simply jumps from one stage to the next in modern sets, not realizing that somewhere out in the real world, a legal dispute and a performer's opinion decided whether a spoon-bending Pokémon could appear on paper. While cards and courtrooms interacted in the background, the handheld games kept experimenting with ways to make stats and growth more complicated than they looked. In red and blue, your Pokémon's strength is shaped by stat experience points behind the scenes. Every time you defeat an enemy, small invisible amounts are added to different stats depending on what you fought. In later generations, this idea becomes effort values with clearer limits and rules. In the earliest games, it is messy and opaque. A team raised entirely by beating hundreds of low-level Caterpie can end up surprisingly powerful. Not because Caterpie are strong, but because the stat gains keep stacking. Most kids had no idea. They just fought whatever was in front of them. Only years later, as communities dissected the code, did people realize that grinding on certain opponents shaped their partners more than others. What felt like, "I just trained a lot," turned out to be a system that rewarded certain patterns without ever explaining itself on screen. On television, the same sort of hidden shaping was happening with character arcs. For a long time, Team Rocket were meant to be simple, repeating villains. They had a boss we rarely saw, a simple goal of stealing Pikachu, and a script pattern they followed almost every week. But over time, Jesse, James, and Meowth picked up bits of backstory. James's wealthy family and arranged marriage, Jesse's days in a harsh winter and failed auditions, Meowth's struggle to learn human speech just to impress a female Meowth who ultimately rejected him. None of these details change the basic rhythm of the episodes. They still show up, make a plan, fail, and blast off again. Yet each flashback adds a thin layer of sympathy over the cartoon villainy. You are still meant to laugh when they lose, but you also see that they are more than just a punchline. They are three people who keep chasing a dream that never quite works out, staying together anyway. Elsewhere in the anime, an early decision about a single butterfly helps set the tone for all future goodbyes. In one of the most remembered early episodes, Ash releases his Butterfree so it can migrate with a flock and stay with a purple Butterfree it is bonded with. The story was originally pitched with Pidgeotto filling that role instead. The staff eventually chose Butterfree because its design and evolution felt more visually striking, and the idea of a gentle, colorful Pokémon flying away into the distance carried more emotion. You can picture that scene. A boat, a sky full of Butterfree, and one trainer standing at the rail, waving as his first fully evolved partner disappears into a bright horizon. That single moment quietly established that goodbyes, not just victories, would be an important part of the show. Later, departures, like Misty returning to her gym, or May leaving to focus on contests, echo that same tone. Back in the games, a different kind of farewell exists entirely in code. In Pokémon Emerald's Battle Frontier, deep in the save system, there's a glitch that allows you to clone Pokémon and items. By carefully timing when you save and reset near the Battle Tower's PC. You can make a copy of a team or a stack of rare objects. For some players, this became a way to experiment without risk. For others, it was a gentle exploit they used to duplicate hard-to-get legendaries and event items. The developers never patched it out. On cartridges, there was no easy way to do so. As a result, the cloning trick lived on as a kind of open secret. People who knew about it used it quietly. People who did not continued playing in the intended way, completely unaware that right next to one of the hardest facilities in the game, the system would let them break scarcity in half if they asked in just the right way. On the competitive side of things, Pokémon Stadium 2 on the Nintendo 64 did something subtle that many kids missed. Its rental Pokémon, the pre-made teams you could borrow if you did not want to import your own, were not random. Their movesets often reflected strategies that were considered strong at the time, certain coverage moves on sweepers, certain status moves on defensive Pokémon, certain combinations that mirrored what players were doing on their Game Boys. Without ever calling it a lesson, the game gave you a crash course in viable builds just by letting you scroll through and pick a rental team. You can imagine a younger player, without access to forums or guides, experimenting with those rentals and slowly absorbing the idea that a water type with an ice move or an electric type with a specific coverage attack simply felt more reliable. It was a gentle, quiet way for the console game to teach fundamentals of competition long before the official term metagame meant anything to most people. In a different generation, Pokémon Black and White on the Nintendo DS chose to push on the story side instead of mechanics. In the Unova region, the villainous group, Team Plasma, argues that Pokémon should be freed from human trainers. Their leader, N, is gentle, can hear Pokémon's hearts, and genuinely believes that taking creatures away from their owners is an act of kindness. As you travel and battle gym leaders, some characters agree with him, at least a little. Others do not. The story quietly invites you to ask whether keeping creatures in balls and making them battle is truly fair. In early drafts, that moral tension was meant to be even stronger, with more gym leaders and side characters openly taking N's side. Parts of that were softened in the final script, but enough remains that Black and White feel different from earlier regions. The bad guys are not just thieves or power-hungry villains. They are people who might have a point, even if their methods and hidden motives are wrong. You can imagine lying there, half asleep, thinking about a world where a soft-spoken young man stands in the middle of a crowd and tells trainers to look at the friends in their Pokeballs and ask themselves whether they are doing the right thing. The game never forces you to answer out loud. It just lets that question hang in the air as you continue collecting badges and stopping a plan that, on the surface, is meant to save Pokémon. Across anime, games, and cards, all of these details show how often Pokémon brushes up against deeper questions and oddities while still looking bright and simple on the outside. A champion who was not allowed to win too early. Companions who almost left and then returned. A legendary caught by tricking memory. Letters in ruins that might be spelling out a message from something old. A stage magician who once kept a psychic Pokémon off the table. Invisible numbers shaping your team. Villains who start to look like tragic figures if you listen long enough. They are all threads running through the same fabric, occasionally catching on your attention as you play or watch, then sliding back into the background while you move on to the next route, the next gym, the next pack of cards. Out in the real world, away from handhelds and TV screens, Pokémon has slipped into stranger places than most people realize. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, schoolyards were full of rumors about cursed cards. Some kids whispered that psychic-type cards in the trading card game were bad luck because of their purple color and eerie artwork. Others said that certain energy cards should never be carried in a pocket because they might attract accidents or bad grades. None of it was true in any measurable way, of course, but the story spread the same way ghost stories do. Slowly, with just enough detail to feel possible when you are young and holding something you do not fully understand. You can imagine a kid sitting cross-legged on a playground, flipping past a Kadabra or a Mewtwo, and quietly deciding not to include it in their deck just in case, even while knowing, deep down, that cardboard cannot really do anything to the world outside the game. The idea of curses growing around certain colors and symbols is just another way the series slipped beyond its own rules into the soft space of childhood imagination. At the same time, official tournaments and rule books were forming a very different, stricter frame around those same cards. The DCI, the organized play body that handled Pokémon events in the West in those early days, had to decide what was fair. Some promo cards were marked not legal because they had unusual backs, unreadable text, or bizarre effects. Others were allowed only in certain formats or banned when they warped the metagame too far in one direction. A shiny, rune-covered card like Ancient Mew might feel powerful in a child's hands, but judges would calmly explain that it could not be used in sanctioned matches. The contrast is almost amusing if you picture it. On one side, a group of kids huddled on the ground, treating a particular card like a forbidden artifact. On the other, a quiet adult at a tournament table, pointing to a line in a rulebook and saying, "No, you simply cannot play that here. Please choose something else." The same card, two completely different kinds of power projected onto it. Back inside the games, another kind of projected power appears in the way people talk about certain Pokédex entries. The Pokédex is full of strange and sometimes unsettling lines. Dreyfloon tries to pull children into the afterlife by holding their hands. Yamask carries a mask that used to be its human face and is said to cry when it looks at it. Phantump is supposedly the spirit of a child who died lost in the woods, reborn as a tiny tree stump with glowing eyes. Banette is described as a doll that came to life out of pure hatred after being discarded, wandering around with a zipper mouth and a grudge. Most players read these lines once and move on, treating them like spooky flavor text. Others linger on them. The idea that some Pokémon were once human, or that a stuffed toy could wake up and seek revenge, is a far cry from the bright, friendly tone of the anime's opening theme. It hints at a much darker folklore, living quietly inside a children's series, almost like a separate ghost layer that only shows up if you choose to press A on the right pages. You can imagine lying in bed, Game Boy, or Switch on your chest, reading those entries late at night. Outside your window, everything is still. Inside your console, a small balloon tries to carry someone away, and a mask stares back at a creature that might once have been a person. The game does not lean on these details. It simply records them once like a whispered rumor, and then lets you move on. The anime has its own way of brushing up against the unsettling, not just with ghosts, but with the strange ways humans and Pokémon can overlap. Several times throughout the series, there are hints that people can be turned into Pokémon or possessed by them. In one story, a girl befriends a spectral Pokémon in a forest, only for it to be implied that she might not be entirely human anymore by the end. In others, characters are turned to stone, frozen in crystal, or merged with legendary Pokémon in climactic movie moments. The imagery is rarely graphic, but the idea of losing your human shape, even temporarily, is quietly intense if you stop and think about it. At the same time, the show goes out of its way to ground that intensity in moments of kindness. A legendary creature that merges with a human might do so to save them. A possession might be lifted by friendship and understanding. A cursed object might be calmed by apologizing or letting something go. The message that slips underneath all the bright colors and dramatic attacks is that even the strangest, scariest situations in this world can be softened if someone is willing to stay and listen. In a different corner of the franchise, manga volumes go one step further. Some arcs in the Pokémon Adventures manga show gym leaders working directly with criminal organizations, using their Pokémon in ways that feel brutal compared to the TV show. A battle might leave visible marks. A plan might involve draining energy from captured Pokémon to power machines. Legendary creatures are not just distant, awe-inspiring beings, but active forces in battles that reshape cities and landscapes. The storytelling treats these events with more weight. If a town is attacked, people are hurt, and the consequences linger into later chapters. For readers who only knew the anime's more sanitized tone, picking up a volume of the manga and seeing a trainer stand in front of a rampaging legendary as buildings crumble can be startling. It shows another version of the same world, one where the stakes suggested in the game's dialogue are fully realized on the page. While the manga pushes the danger outward, some of the games push technology inward. In later generations, certain Pokeballs and devices start to hint at the limits of capturing and controlling Pokemon. The GS Ball, a mysterious golden and silver ball from the anime, and some early promotional material, was originally set up as a key item with an unknown purpose. In the Japanese version of Pokémon Crystal, it is tied to an event involving Celebi in Ilex Forest. Outside Japan, those plans changed. The GS Ball was quietly dropped from the international releases and from the main anime story, leaving it as a loose thread that fans still mention when they talk about abandoned plot lines. You can imagine a timeline where the GS Ball became as iconic as the Master Ball, a symbol of special, story-driven encounters. Instead, it became more like Mirage Island or the unfinished Safari Zone, something that exists in partial form, visible only if you know where to look or which version to play. The handhelds themselves leave traces of time and technology in the way their games age. On Game Boy Advance, cartridges of Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, a small internal battery powers the real-time clock. Over the years, those batteries can run dry. When that happens, your save file still works, but time-based events stop. Berries no longer grow. Daily events no longer roll over. The world keeps moving in other ways, but the plants and schedules freeze. Players discovered this slowly, often by accident. They would return to their berry patches and notice that days later, nothing had changed. At first, they thought it was a bug, or that they had forgotten to water them. Only later did they learn that the game was, in a sense, aging. The cartridge hardware was gently decaying, and part of the world inside had gone still. Some people opened their cartridges and replaced the batteries themselves, carefully soldering new ones in. Others accepted that their Hoenn was now trapped in a kind of permanent present. You can picture a copy of Sapphire lying in a drawer for 10 years, then being slotted back into an old handheld on a nostalgic afternoon. The title screen still works. Your team is still there. The Hall of Fame records are intact. Somewhere in the data, a flag notes that the clock battery is dry, and the berry fields have been waiting in the same exact state for a decade, as if time stopped the moment you put the game away. The mobile era brought Pokémon into another kind of time loop. Pokémon Go's early tracking system, the 3-step indicator, showed how far away nearby Pokémon were. 1 set of footprints meant close, 2 meant a bit farther, 3 meant far. When the system broke and stopped updating correctly, players kept staring at it anyway, trying to make sense of footsteps that never changed. Eventually, the developers removed it, replacing it with different forms of tracking. But for a while, millions of people walked around neighborhoods at night, chasing invisible monsters with a broken guide, convinced that one more street, one more corner would make the steps drop. It is almost funny to think of it now. A generation of players moving through their own real cities, guided by an interface that was not actually telling them anything useful, relying instead on instinct, rumor, and shared tips. In that sense, the modern phone era did not look so different from the old schoolyard days of "I heard Mew is under the truck" and "My cousin caught Missingno and his game still works." In merchandising and side projects, other odd experiments kept quietly appearing and disappearing. There was a time when dedicated Pokémon centers in Japan sold limited-run items like Pikachu-shaped N64 consoles, special edition Game Boy colors with Pichu outlines, or plushies of characters that barely showed up in the anime but had strong fan followings in niche corners of the internet. Some of these items were never reprinted. A toy or accessory that felt ordinary for a child in Tokyo in the year 2000 might be an expensive collector's item for someone shopping online decades later. You can picture a small apartment filled with these things: a GameCube with a Lugia logo, a stack of card boxes from early sets, a shelf of plushies with tags from promotions long gone. For the outside world, they are just objects. For the person who bought them at the time, they are timestamps of what Pokémon looked like in a particular year, on a particular street, in a particular store. In all of these stories, the details pile up like layers of dust on top of a very simple core. A child meets a strange creature. They form a bond. They travel together. Around that core, the world keeps growing stranger. Cards are banned or worshipped. Ghost stories blossom out of melancholy town themes. Spin-off games lean into heartbreak and sacrifice. Battery-backed clocks run down. Anime plots are rewritten midstream. Devices and items appear in one region and vanish in another. A phone app briefly turns entire cities into impromptu safaris. A plush, made for a single event, becomes a holy grail for some distant collector. And yet, if you strip all of it away, what is left is still a trainer tossing a ball, a friendship slowly building, a journey that is never quite finished. All these odd facts and side paths are like little side routes off the main road, interesting to wander through for a while, but always leading back, eventually, to that simple image of someone and their partner walking forward together under a sky that might be morning in Johto, sunset in Hoenn, or nighttime in some region that has not even been announced yet when you finally fall asleep. If you think about the way Pokémon stories usually begin, they are almost always the same. A quiet town, a simple room, a first partner waiting in a lab or standing on a professor's desk, a choice between three types, a promise that your journey starts today. But scattered all through the franchise are beginnings that twist that pattern just a little bit, enough to feel like they belong to a different kind of tale. In Pokémon Colosseum on the GameCube, there is no gentle professor and no pick between three starters. Instead, the game opens with an explosion. A young man steals a strange machine from a criminal base, blows the building up behind him, and rides away on a futuristic hoverbike with two already evolved Pokémon by his side. His partners are an Espeon and an Umbreon, not cute babies, and the first hours of the game revolve around taking corrupt, shadowy Pokémon from villains and purifying them rather than catching carefree wild ones in grass. You can imagine seeing that intro for the first time after years of the main handheld games. Instead of a bright field in a small town, you get sparks, metal, and a desert at night. Instead of a professor telling you to fill a Pokédex, you get a former criminal slowly trying to make up for past mistakes. It is still Pokémon, but it feels like an alternate universe where the stakes started a little higher from the very beginning. The anime toyed with alternate beginnings too. Before the main series became such a long-running fixture, there were discussions about starting the show with a different protagonist completely. In some early planning, the manga's lead, a trainer named Red, was considered as the main character. Clefairy was even positioned as a possible mascot partner in place of Pikachu, especially in gag-heavy manga stories where it played a louder, more chaotic role. In the end, the team chose Ash and Pikachu, with the now familiar yellow mouse as the central image. It is strange to imagine the ripple effect if that choice had gone the other way. A world where children everywhere knew Clefairy as the face of the franchise. A world where Ash never existed, replaced by a more game-accurate protagonist who caught and evolved more often. Instead, the version we have now feels so obvious that it is hard to picture anything else. Some beginnings were introduced and then quietly erased. The GS ball in the anime, a mysterious gold and silver Pokeball, delivered to Ash with instructions to take it to Kurt in Azalea Town, was originally set up as the hook for a larger storyline. For a while, it follows the group from region to region, important enough that they mention it repeatedly. Then suddenly, it is gone. Behind the scenes, plans for a Celebi-focused arc tied to the GS ball were replaced by the decision to tell Celebi's story in a feature film instead. The ball is left with Kurt off-screen and never seen again. To the viewer, it feels as if a thread was dropped mid-stitch. You can imagine a different version of the Johto saga, where that strange ball opens in a forest glade, revealing a time-traveling mythical Pokémon in a TV episode instead of in a movie theater. Instead, the object that was meant to kick off that arc becomes just another piece of unresolved lore. quietly stored in a craftsman's house. The trading card game experimented with new starts of its own. For a while, some early theme decks were built around the idea of giving new players a full mini-story in card form. You might buy a deck centered on Team Rocket, with artwork that shows them causing trouble across Kanto, or a deck based around a gym leader's Pokémon that lets you imagine yourself battling as them. The packaging, the coins, and even some of the flavor text gently framed your first games as if you were stepping into a role rather than just shuffling cardboard. Those decks taught basic concepts, but they also slipped in little bits of world building. A particular trainer's card might hint at a hobby or a fear not shown in the games yet. A stadium might depict a location only briefly mentioned elsewhere. For kids who started with the TCG instead of the Game Boy games, those were their first routes and towns, table surfaces, sleeves, and small play mats that unfolded like maps you could hold. While the TCG was offering small role-play beginnings, another branch of the franchise gave players a different kind of stage. In Pokémon contests in Ruby and Sapphire, and later in the Super contests of Diamond and Pearl, your journey's side path is not just about battling. It is about making your Pokémon look cool, cute, tough, smart, or beautiful in front of judges and a crowd. Instead of worrying about type matchups, you think about move combinations that dazzle an audience and about decorating your partners with ribbons and accessories. You can imagine a young coordinator standing backstage, not with a team built to sweep competitive ladders, but with a single partner trained to spin, dance, and pose. Instead of hyper beams and earthquakes, you have sparkles and synchronized steps. For some players, this was their first taste of thinking about Pokémon as performers rather than fighters, a thread that would be picked up later in the anime with characters like May and Dawn competing in contests instead of gyms. The anime mirrored that shift, letting some characters' journeys begin in front of spotlights rather than inside gyms. May starts off not even liking Pokémon much, only traveling because she wants to see the world. When she discovers contests, her path clicks into place. Dawn idolizes coordinators from the beginning, stepping into the role with far more intention. Their performances, with carefully choreographed combinations of attacks, felt very different from Ash's straightforward battle style. For children watching, these arcs said, without making a big speech about it, that being a strong trainer could also mean being expressive, stylish, and creative. Behind the action and glamour, another sort of quiet technical story was happening in the background of later games. On the Nintendo DS and beyond, mystery gift distributions turned rare Pokémon and special items into limited-time events. Sometimes you had to go to a physical location, like a game store or a convention, to download a legendary. Other times, you just connected over Wi-Fi during a certain window. If you were there and you knew about it, you got a mythical creature, a unique move, or a special item. If you missed that window, the opportunity was gone unless the event was rerun years later. You can picture standing in a store with a handheld in your pocket, quietly downloading a small piece of code that represents something like a Mew, a Jirachi, or a Victini, while other shoppers browse around you with no idea that anything unusual is happening. Decades from now, someone might pick up that same cartridge secondhand, boot it up, and discover an event Pokémon sitting in a box, preserved like a pressed flower from a limited season long past. The idea of you had to be there stretches into the physical world in other ways too. Special distributions tied to movies in Japan often involved staff handing out tickets or devices in cinemas, letting viewers receive a legendary that matched the film's star. For those kids, going to the theater meant not just watching a story, but taking a piece of it home in their save file. Outside those regions, players might only ever see that same Pokémon as a rumor online or as a rare trade partner's prized possession. You can imagine the excitement of sitting in a dark theater, watching a climax where a legendary unleashes a signature move, and knowing that when you step out into the lobby, someone at a small booth will help that same creature quietly appear on your own screen. Not every limited experience involved something rare or powerful. Some were just strange experiments that left marks and then vanished. For a short time, certain McDonald's locations offered Pokémon-themed e-reader cards or mini-games that worked with hardware add-ons almost nobody talks about anymore. The e-reader, a device you could plug into a Game Boy Advance, lets you swipe special cards to unlock small levels, berries, or even trainers in some games. In practice, it meant that a small set of people with the right peripherals could access tiny pieces of content that never made it into the main cartridges for everyone else. If you think about it now, it is like a prototype version of modern DLC delivered through printed strips instead of downloads. It did not last long, but the bits of data it unlocked are still floating around in certain old save files and collections, preserved mostly by enthusiasts who went out of their way to collect and scan every card. The anime had its own small, easily missed experiments. Between movies and on special occasions, short theatrical pieces and TV shorts were created that focused entirely on the Pokémon rather than their trainers. These word-light stories showed Pikachu, Meowth, and others wandering through forests, islands, or abandoned amusement parks, solving tiny problems without much human dialogue. They felt almost like silent films, relying on expressions and sound effects rather than constant conversation. For kids used to Ash and friends chattering through every scene, these shorts were a chance to see how the world might look if you were just a small creature padding through the grass, dealing with weather, hunger, and curiosity one step at a time. Many of them were never shown widely outside their original release, turning into little hidden pockets of animation history that only surface occasionally via clips and re-releases. Side projects even explored what Pokémon might look like if humans and creatures swapped classic roles. Detective Pikachu on the 3DS, and later on, the big screen shows a Pikachu with a deep voice, a mind for clues, and a taste for coffee, solving mysteries with a human partner who can understand him. Instead of a trainer commanding attacks in battle, you have a small creature walking through crime scenes in a hat, examining footprints and motives. The world is familiar, full of Kanto and beyond species, but the structure is closer to a mystery novel than an RPG. You can imagine playing that game late at night, earbuds in, listening to this oddly serious Pikachu explain contradictions in witness statements. It is still cute. It is still light, but it hints at how that universe can be bent into almost any genre: adventure, mystery, slice of life, horror, sports, or even cooking shows without breaking its basic rules. Even the most playful experiments leave traces in how fans imagine the world. Spin-offs like Pokemon Snap, where you ride a rail cart through environments, taking pictures instead of battling, change how you think about what these creatures do when trainers are not around. Instead of fainting and returning to balls, they are eating, sleeping, migrating, and playing. A Charizard lounging in a lava pool, or a group of Bulbasaur dozing near a river feel more like wildlife documentary moments than combatants. Later, new Pokemon Snap built on that idea, showing day and night cycles and multiple behaviors depending on how patient you are. If you snap enough photos and pay attention, you start to see small stories. A Pidgeot checking on its nest, a Pichu and Scorbunny playing in the grass, a Magikarp being tossed around by waves. None of it is required to win anything. It is just there for you to notice, like background details in a painting. All of these tangents, from darker GameCube openings to quiet contest stages, from exclusive event distributions to experimental shorts, have one thing in common. They are doors. Some of them open onto stories about criminals and redemption. Some lead to ribbon-filled halls and bright spotlights. Some drop you into theaters and fast food restaurants, holding out mythical Pokémon and mini games to whoever shows up at the right time. Some pull you into silent forests where only Pokémon voices are heard. Others wrap the familiar mascot in a detective's hat and ask you to follow clues instead of a route. You can move through as many or as few of those doors as you like. For some people, Pokémon is only ever the main handheld games, gyms, and the Elite Four. For others, their first memories are of a contest stage, a movie distribution, a pre-release card, or a railcart camera clicking through caves. The facts and stories about those places might sound obscure when you list them out at night, one by one. But to someone, somewhere, each of them was simply the first doorway they happened to step through on the way into this world. In some regions, even the flow of time itself becomes part of the story. In Pokémon Black and White, the Unova region quietly shifts through 4 in-game seasons. The grass changes color. Certain routes pick up a dusting of snow or a warmer glow. Background music gains or loses instruments, depending on whether the world is in spring, summer, autumn, or winter. Hidden in all that is a small pair of deer, Pokemon, Deerling, and Sawsbuck, whose appearance changes with the season. Flowering buds, lush green leaves, warm browns, or frosted antlers, all determined by what time of year it is inside the game. You can imagine turning your DS back on after a break and noticing that the world just looks slightly different. Trees a bit more orange, the light just a little more muted, your Deerling in a new coat without you doing anything at all. It is a tiny reminder that even when you are not playing, the clock is still moving forward somewhere in the background, quietly repainting the same fields you walked through yesterday. A different generation asked you to carry that sense of movement into the real world. When Heart Gold and Soul Silver released, they came with a small round device shaped like a Pokeball, the Pokewalker. You could transfer one of your Pokemon into it, clip it to your belt, or slip it into a pocket and let your steps turn into experience points, items, or encounters. Each movement earned watts, which you could spend on a simple radar to find wild Pokemon, or a dowsing option to uncover small gifts. At the end of the day, you sent everything back to your cartridge and saw what your walk had turned into. You can picture a school bag with a little red and white circle hanging off the side, quietly counting every stride between home and class. To anyone else, it is just a pedometer. To you, it is a tiny private route where a single partner is leveling up one step at a time. The act of walking down an ordinary street becomes part of the same journey as surfing between islands or climbing through caves. Years later, another device asked you to take Pokémon with you into an even quieter part of your day: sleep. Pokémon Sleep turns your phone into a kind of bedside observer. You place it next to your pillow, let it listen for movement, and in the morning, it tells you what kind of night you had. The app sorts your rest into gentle categories and shows different Pokémon gathering around a dozing Snorlax, depending on how long and how peacefully you slept. Instead of battling or catching actively, you are rewarded for doing nothing at all, for simply resting. You can imagine waking up, blinking in the morning light, and checking which creatures visited while you were completely unaware. A Pikachu curled at Snorlax's side, a Slowpoke sprawled out without a care, maybe a group of little starters piled together, mirroring the way you might have been curled under your own blanket. It is a strange reversal. The better you are at being still, the more things happen inside that tiny screen. Even the trading card game occasionally leans into quiet strangeness instead of straightforward battles. One of the oddest cards to ever exist is simply called Imakuni, featuring a real person, a performer in a black costume with cartoonish features. The card's effect is more of a joke than a strategic advantage, even allowing you to confuse your own active Pokémon. Other cards linked to that same figure, like Imakuni's Doduo, play with the rules in ways that feel more like a wink to the player than a serious attempt to win tournaments. You can imagine sitting across from a friend, both of you trying to build serious decks, when suddenly they slap down this bizarre card with a man dancing on it. The text tells you to do something that makes no real sense in a tight match. For a moment, the whole careful structure of hit points and damage calculations cracks, and you remember that this whole thing started as a game meant to be a little bit silly. On television, the sound of Pokémon has shaped how people remember the series just as much as the pictures. The Japanese opening Aim to be a Pokémon Master sings about setting off from your hometown, traveling with friends, and becoming stronger together. When the anime came to English-speaking countries, it arrived with a different focus. The theme most people know opens with the promise to be the very best and wraps itself around a single phrase: "Gotta catch 'em all." That line was chosen as a slogan and then folded back into the song, turning the act of collecting into a central idea for a whole generation of kids. You can imagine two living rooms in different parts of the world. In one, a child hears a song about aiming for mastery and leaning on your friends as you face challenges. In the other, a child hears a song about catching everything in sight and pushing to be number one. The images on the screen are almost the same, but the words nudging the story along are slightly different. Like two translators standing on either side of the same picture and describing it in their own ways. The further you look, the more you find these small differences that only really stand out when you compare notes. A route that looks a little more orange in one month than another. A device that turns footsteps into experience. A sleep app that rewards you for staying still. A card that breaks the fourth wall and confuses your own Pokémon. A theme song that quietly shifts the emphasis from traveling with companions to catching absolutely everything. None of these things change the core of the franchise, but they color the edges in ways that can feel deeply personal if they happen to be part of your own first experiences. By now, you have drifted through a lot of those edges. You have walked through unfinished safari zones that only exist in code and listened to haunted town themes that inspired modern ghost stories. You have visited future ruins in Mystery Dungeon and watched a partner fade away only to be brought back by a legendary's kindness. You have seen artworks on cards soften or change as they crossed borders. You have peeked behind the curtain of the anime, where characters almost left forever or were kept alive because fans loved them too much. You have followed glitches that accidentally created legends, like Missing No and Level 7 Mew. You have watched Unknown float in ruins that feel like they should connect to a god, even if nobody ever says it out loud. You have seen villains who fail with a smile, villains who almost convince you they are right, and villains who were once planned to be something much darker. You have stepped onto contest stages, contest decks, and contest cards. You have looked at clocks inside cartridges that quietly ran down while you were busy growing up. All of that, all those strange side paths and nearly forgotten details are still built around something very small and simple. A trainer and a partner. A journey that starts in a room in a quiet town. A first step onto a route. A single Pokeball thrown in a patch of grass. A nickname typed in on a small screen. A decision to keep going just one more route, one more gym, one more league, one more region. Whether you come in through an anime episode, a card pulled from a booster pack, a spin-off game, or a mobile app that tracks your sleep, you eventually find your way back to that same image. So, as this last stretch of facts and stories taps gently at the edges of your memory, it is okay if you do not grab hold of every detail. You do not have to remember every name, every glitch, every scrapped feature, every piece of lost merchandise or unfinished map. You do not need to summon back exactly which episode was banned where, or which card had its artwork changed, or which distribution happened in which year. All of those things can stay where they are, scattered across cartridges, books, and servers, sleeping quietly on their own. Right now, you are just lying there, listening. Maybe you are picturing a dark room lit only by a Game Boy screen, or the pale blue of a DS in the back seat of a car at night. Maybe you are seeing a pile of worn cards bound with a rubber band. Maybe it is the opening notes of a theme song, a snippet of anime dialogue, or the way a particular town tune felt the first time you heard it. Whatever floats up is fine. Whatever slips away again is fine too. The world of Pokémon is very good at waiting. Regions stay frozen in their save files until you load them. Routes stay empty until your footsteps appear. Old systems like the Pokewalker or the e-reader can sit in a box for years and still blink back to life if someone pops a battery in. Sleep apps will be there again tomorrow night if you want them. Glitches and secrets do not mind if you never use them at all. They are just possibilities, resting in the code. You, on the other hand, do not have to keep track of any of it right now. You can let your breathing slow down. Feel the weight of your body settling into the mattress. Let your thoughts drift from unfinished safari zones and seasonal deerling to something softer, like the image of a Snorlax napping in the middle of a sunlit road, content and immovable. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a little party of sprites might be setting up camp, sharing a fire, curling up inside a tent while the screen fades to black. If your eyes are not closed yet, you can let them fall shut whenever you are ready. The stories, the facts, the strange details about broken mechanics and lost episodes will still be there the next time you come back, waiting patiently like a save file on the title screen. For tonight, it is enough to know that this world exists, that it has room for ghost stories and contests and desserts and forests and cities made of glass and steel, and that you can visit any of them whenever you want. For now, you can just rest. Somewhere out there, a trainer and their partner are still walking under a starry sky in some region that never quite gets old. You do not have to follow them this time. You can let the sound of their footsteps fade. Let the last bits of trivia sink down into the background and drift off, knowing that whenever you wake up, that world will still be waiting for you to press A and continue.